For those of you just joining us, welcome. Robyn Roscoe will share her expertise with us on cultivating your strengths. Robyn, over to you.
Thank you very much, Laura, and to Miapar for having me here today. And good morning or good afternoon to all of you who are participating today. Thank you for taking the time. And thanks again, Laura, for that great introduction. I won't spend any more time talking about myself and where I come from. You will all receive a copy of the slide materials after the presentation today, and that will include this slide with all of my contact information on it. If after the session you have any questions that you'd like to ask, or some other points that you want to cover that maybe I didn't touch on in the session today, please feel free to contact me afterwards and I'd be happy to help you out. Just a few ground rules for the session today. You can ask questions at any time, and there'll be a couple of pauses where I'll be asking you to think about and perhaps contribute to the conversation through the chat feature. Because we're going to be talking about individual strengths, and I'm going to be sharing some information about my personal journey to understand my strengths and use them in my work, I would remind you to make sure that your comments and your questions are respectful and thoughtful and kind for all of us who are going to be participating today. Our goals for today, we're going to be just defining what we mean by strength and weakness. We'll look at how we can do assessments for individual strengths. We'll talk about something called least strengths. And then lastly, a recipe for cultivating our strengths called naming, aiming, and claiming. So first off, to talk about what we mean by strength. Now, one of the challenges I often have with this is strength is one of those terms that it's really hard to use another word for it when you're talking about an individual or personal strength that you might have for something. I guess I'll just open it up to the group to see how would you define strength when it comes to your skills or abilities in the workplace. And you can use the chat box to provide some suggestions here. So something that you're confident in doing, that's a really good way to say it. Skills where you're the go-to person on the team. So things that you can do that others can't, or they would rely on you for the work that you're going to be doing together. All of those are a part of what we might refer to as our strengths. Oftentimes when we talk about strengths and weaknesses, we think about specific skills and abilities that we have. Perhaps we're a very fast typist, or we have a really good memory. All of those are things that are our individual strengths, but when it comes to understanding what kinds of things we do and the ways in which we work most effectively, thinking about how we do that is a way that we can describe our strengths that can then help us understand how we can build on those and use them when they're most appropriate and effective for the work that we're doing. So some of the ways that we can define strengths, we often think about strength as being a physical thing, somebody who is physically strong. We can also talk about strong feelings that we might have for something or someone. We can have strong weather patterns or strong waves or strong storms, so the intensity of natural forces. We can make strong arguments for something that we are trying to defend or something that we're trying to assert. We can also have strong materials that we would encounter in our work or in our lives. And strength can also refer to the size of a team or the number of people comprising a group. So the strength of an army might be the numbers of people that are in it. But what we're really wanting to focus on is the things, the good qualities or attributes that we have that allow us to be effective and make contributions to the work that we're doing. Weaknesses are the flip side of strengths. So we can think about these again from a physical perspective. So lacking in strength would be considered to be a weakness. Something that we're unable to resist. So we might have a weakness for a particular thing. I have a weakness for anything with caramel in it. We can also refer to weaknesses as being our Achilles heel. So an area where we have vulnerability that maybe we're not aware of or that others are not aware of, but it is an area where we have that vulnerability, and it can be a weakness for us in any particular environment. But often when in this environment, we're thinking about weaknesses as being qualities or features that can be regarded as a disadvantage. So something that is going to impair or hinder us from performing at our strongest. So like we said in the definition, strengths can sometimes be physical. We can often think about strengths as having some kind of dimension, strong emotions, a strong mind, strong connections in a social environment. We can even have spiritual strength if that's the environment that we're talking about. What I'm looking for when I talk about cultivating strengths is coming up with the language that describes the best of ourselves, the things that we are strongest at, that we can best contribute to the work that we're going to be doing. And understanding and naming those things then helps us build on them in ways that allow us to make better contributions to the work that we're wanting to do. A lot of times these are hard to see. As I mentioned before, when we think about strengths, sometimes we talk about specific skills that we have, and those can be easy to identify. But when we want to talk about the way in which we work, they can be hard to see or hard to describe in ourselves. And they can also be things that we do without thinking, or ways that we work without consciously knowing that we're doing it. And when we're working with others who don't share those strengths, we have a hard time understanding why they can't do that, why they can't work in the same way that we're doing. And it could be because we have that strength and they don't. So it can be hard to describe and hard to identify. And so the first thing that we need to do in cultivating our strengths is be able to identify what they are. And so I'm going to go through with you some of the approaches that I followed to identifying my own strengths and ways that I can work on applying them. So when I started to put this session together, I looked back at my own history of assessing what my strengths were. I've done some concrete focused work on it in the last few years. But when I started to think about it, I realized it's something that I've actually been trying to understand and describe to myself for a long time. So I looked back in some old journals of mine, and I found this Post-it note that remarkably was still stuck to the paper. From January of 1993. And there was things going on in terms of my career. I was making some changes and transitions, and I was trying to understand for myself, what are the things that I'm good at? But more, I was trying to think about how I might describe that if somebody were to ask me, what are your strengths for this particular role, if I was in a job interview or being considered for a new position. So I tried to think about the things that I'm good at in my relationships. Listening, organizing, analyzing. My handwriting has not improved, I can assure you of that over the years. So these were the things that I felt that I was good at. But the challenge with this type of description, I'm a good listener, I'm a very organized person, is they're very broad. And they don't necessarily say that you would be good in a particular role. And they really talk more generally about the way in which you behave and the way in which you like to work. So they weren't specific enough for me to describe to somebody else what are the things that I'm good at and how would that make a difference in the work or the role that I'm being considered for. So I've done a variety of other assessments, and I'm sure some of you have too. Maybe if you would like, in the chat box, you can tell us about other assessments that you might have done. There are lots of them out there. They all work the same way. You do some kind of online quiz or test, and then the results go off somewhere and they send you back what your assessment is, usually trying to tell you, again, the things that you would be good at and how you might be assessed in terms of your personality. Again, what we're looking for is information that we can then use for managing our behavior and building on the things that we're good at. So I've done this kind of assessment before, a Myers-Briggs type assessment. I'm sure lots of you have heard of this before. It tells you whether you're introverted or extroverted and goes through a variety of different spectrums that you can be on with different individual traits. So we can see from this what my scores are for introverted, intuitive, etc. And then it gives some other suggestions. The challenge, again, that I had with this is that it talks more about my personality and the way I am, rather than the things that I can do and that I can contribute in any particular environment. Another type of assessment that I've done is something called the Herman Brain Dominance Indicator. And again, a quiz you do, send the results away, they send you back a score. In this case, the results that I got back, it looks like it says that I'm good at everything. What it really means is that I'm balanced and I'm able to function well in any one of these types of realms, in a logical environment, in an artistic environment. It doesn't mean that I'm good or particularly strong in any one of them. It means that I'm comfortable and able to adapt to any environment in which I might be working. And I would say from my own reflection that that's probably true. I think I can be effective and comfortable with a variety of different people in a variety of different environments. So again, this was an interesting assessment of myself, but it didn't give me the tools and specifically the language that I wanted to have to understand what it is that I am good at. What are the roles and work that are most suitable for me in order to make contributions in my work environment. Another type of assessment, again, a bunch of questions coming back with some kind of grid that shows you where your strengths happen to be. In this case, I was determined to be a creative supporting helper with an accommodating feel. When I'm less conscious about what I'm doing, I'm still in the creative helper kind of mode. Again, this was a little bit more helpful in terms of understanding what kinds of roles I would like and function well in, but it didn't give me what I was looking for in terms of understanding what I am good at and would be able to contribute to. So Laura has suggested the find your 24 character strengths. Thank you for sharing that, Laura. I will look into that because I'm an inveterate quiz taker and explorer of tools that I might be able to use to learn more about myself and then use that information in my work. Most of the tools that you will encounter in an online environment do require some sort of registration, and a lot of them also require a fee for what the test that you're going to take and the information that you're going to get. If you're putting in the effort to explore these things, and some of those might be worth the investment for the tool that you're going to use. And the two that I'm going to focus on for the rest of the session today are these ones. STANDOUT, which is a strengths assessment book that you can buy. And in the book, you get a code that then lets you go online to do the assessment and get your report. And then you can read about the different strengths in the book to understand what ones were assessed for you and how you can learn and build on those. The CLIFTONSTRENGTHS 34 assessment is another online one that you can do. There is a small fee that's associated with that one as well. And again, you get a detailed report back for how they've assessed your strengths based on their determinations of how to define strengths and how you fit on the various spectrums for that. So I'm going to talk about the STANDOUT approach first because that's the one that I did first. In STANDOUT, you go online and take a quiz. They give you a report back, and what they tell you is of the 9 possible strengths roles that they have determined, what is the one that is most aligned with the way you like to work and the way you are most effective in your work? And then what is the secondary one? So you have an individual strengths role, and then you have a secondary one that is somewhat maybe your backup position or an additional facet of the way in which you work. As always with all of these kinds of assessments, all of the roles that they describe, all of the strengths that they identify, they're all positive. They're all things that everyone probably wants to be good at and probably can see ways in which that type of approach would make sense in a work environment. And I'll touch on that a little bit more in a bit, how we can look at the various types of strengths that there are and perhaps trying to individually identify one without necessarily doing an assessment to determine which ones are the most appropriate for us and the best reflection of the way in which we work. So when I did my assessment 5 years ago, I think, I bought the book and I read the introduction and I went online and did the quiz. And when I got the results back, I then went through the book and I read the detailed descriptions of the roles that they had determined for me. So in my report, I got back, they determined that my primary role, the way in which I function well and make the best contributions in my work, is a role that they call the equalizer. And my secondary role was connector. So as an equalizer, I like to focus on keeping things in balance, making sure that we have fair outcomes whenever there is a conflict or a negotiation that needs to happen. And I look for opportunities to allow people to build on their own strengths so that they have equal opportunities to participate in what we're doing. So I felt that the description of that strength did align with the way I like to behave. What the strength assessment did, though, is first it gave me some language to describe that way of working, and it also gave me some hints and suggestions about ways that I could build on that strength and use it in situations where it wouldn't be immediately obvious that that was a strength. But if I'm aware of that, I can go directly to that way of working and apply it in those situations. The second one, connector, talked about making connections between people. Now, when I first read this description, I didn't like it. And some of the language that was used in the description, it didn't appeal to me. It wasn't actually a way I felt I wanted to be working. Now, one of the things that happens when you do the standout assessment, you do get to read the descriptions of the other strengths, and it gives you the whole list of all 9 of the strengths and which one is the top scoring one for you and which one is the least scoring one for you. So you're able to see them ranked in order based on your results. So I went and I read through some of the other descriptions, and I had what I can only describe as strengths envy. When I read some of the other descriptions, I decided for myself that I didn't like the way Standout had assessed my strengths. I actually felt that connector was not a good fit for me and advisor was a better fit for me. Why did I think this? Some of it was I liked the language a little bit better about advisor. And I didn't like the idea that the way it described the strength of being a connector was that I brought people together to solve problems, and it sounded like I was offloading my problems to other people. And I wasn't actually helping them. I was basically telling them to go help themselves. And I didn't like the salesman-like approach that there was in the language that was being used. However, when I reviewed this and talked to my coach a bit about it, he got me to describe this a little bit and basically came to the conclusion that how did I think that for me, of the tens of thousands of people that have done this assessment, that I'm the one that they got wrong? How is it possible that with all of the research and background that goes into this kind of assessment, how did I think that I was the one that they got wrong? And why did I choose this one over something else? And I think we tend to look at some of the strengths that we might want to have, things that we think that we're good at. And again, it comes down to that language, to how we describe it, things that come easier to us. So maybe a backup way of doing things that just makes things easier, maybe makes problems go away or makes other people deal with them. It can also be things that we aspire to be, things that we want to be good at, that we think we're not, and we think we should be. And so we want to put some emphasis on those things. It can also be skills that we admire in other people, ways that we see other people behave and function in the workplace, and we want to be more like that. But we do have to accept at some point that our own strengths are just that. These are the ways in which we work, and we work most effectively. And we should recognize and build on those things rather than try and resist them because they're things that we're not so much in favor of. So I took a step back from the assessment, and I spent a couple of weeks just being mindful and aware of my work environment and how I was interacting with other people and solving problems. And I realized that connector actually was a very good way of describing the way that I work with people, not because I deflect problems to others, but because one of the ways in which I often help people get solutions to what they're working on is I put them in touch with somebody who has the skills and information that they're looking for. And I'm very good, it turns out, at recognizing when somebody should be connected to somebody else. because they can learn from each other, they can contribute to each other, and the things that they're trying to accomplish can be achieved. And it was a bit of an aha moment the first time it happened, but it really reinforced to me that actually this is a tool that I use often. And it's also a tool that when I'm struggling with solving a problem, maybe one of the things I need to do is think about who can I connect with in order to help me with this. So I revisited the description, realized that yes, there was a lot of value in recognizing and building on this particular strength. I also took the opportunity to think about others that I know that emulate these strengths. I don't know if they've ever done an assessment to determine this, but they're people that I know that do work in this way and they do it well. And I want to learn from them. So I took the time to connect with people who I know from my past. I use my network to reach out to people to say, could we just have a chat about this so I can understand a little bit about how you use this particular strength. And that was really helpful as well. One of the other things we want to know when we're thinking about our strengths is also our weaknesses. If those are the things that we can use to work well, what are the areas that we need to work on or be aware of? So it can be helpful to name what these things are. And again, not just the skills that we're not good at, but the specific ways of working that are not our favorites or things that we're just not good at doing. It's just a part of the way that we are, that's not a way that we like to work. Being aware of these weaknesses and vulnerabilities, because that's another way to describe them, can be helpful so that we can use our strengths to counteract them. So I tend to refer, instead of referring to things as weaknesses, I tend to refer to them as least strengths. And part of the reason for that is because it's a little bit of a nicer phrase, but also it's when you do strengths assessments, there are no, at least not as far as I was able to determine, there are no comparable assessments that are weakness assessments. There is no language out there that describes the challenges that we might be experiencing or the vulnerabilities that we might have in the ways in which we want to work. So I refer to these as least strengths because that's how I identified and determined them for myself. So I mentioned this strength assessment before, the Clifton Strengths 34. So after I completed the standout assessment, I did this one as well. The two approaches are related because the inventors or creators of the approaches share a common person. And so a lot of the language and the way they work is very similar. But Clifton Strengths gives you your strength list, not a list of 9 roles, but a list of 34 roles. So you get a little bit more granularity about the specifics of the way in which you like to work. And that can be helpful in identifying some specific things that you can do with your strengths, but it's also helpful in identifying your least strengths. So I did the Clifton Strength Assessment. These were my top 5 that came from that. And when I review these, I think they align really well with the equalizer and the connector strengths that I identified through Standout, a ranger, relator, maximizer. All of those align very well with the language that's used in the Standout. I apologize for the noise in the background, but leaf blowing seems to be the thing we always do on Wednesday mornings. So if I think then about looking at the other end of the strengths assessment, when they do this assessment, they give you all 34 of the strengths ordered from 1 to 34 of how you align with all of those strengths. So I decided that if the ones at the top were the things that I was good at, the ones at the bottom of the list must be things that I'm not very good at. So I refer to these as my least strengths. So the ones that were at the bottom of the list for me were futuristic and competition. I'm just going to take a pause and see, has anybody else done the Clifton Strengths Assessment before? And if you have, did you think that the results of it aligned correctly with the way in which you like to work? while you're thinking about and typing that, I will keep going. So because I identified these as my least strengths, I decided to explore them a little bit more to understand why that might be. Why are these things that, of all 34 of the strengths, these are the ones that I'm least good at? So when I look at the first one, the lowest scoring strength for me was competition. Thank you for sharing that, Eva. The Myers-Briggs assessment is a personality assessment, but it does give you some good information about the ways in which you relate to other people and where you might want to fit yourself in an organization in a role that aligns with the way in which you prefer to behave and are at your best. So thinking about these least strengths, competition was the one that was at the bottom of my list. So the thing that I'm least good at. And when I read the description about people who measure their progress against the performance of others and strive to win and revel in contests. And I can tell you without hesitation that I am not good at that. I actually dislike situations where there's going to be a winner and a loser, and that's the way in which success is going to be defined. I don't look forward to competitive environments, and I don't like environments where my performance is measured against others. It's good to know this though, because working in a research-funded environment, we do a lot of competitive things. We have to write grants and we have to talk about how good we are about things in ways that make us shine above other people in order to get funded. So knowing that this is my least strength helped me understand why I sometimes have challenges working in that particular environment. And it helps me to know how I might be able to counteract that by bringing in other people who are good at this or working with people who have comparable strengths to mine to overcome this. The other least strength that I had was futuristic. And again, this is an area that I think I probably should be better at. I should be better at defining a vision for people to follow. As a leader, that's one of the things I'm supposed to do. But I have challenges with that. I have challenges with working on things that are not immediately in front of me and thinking about where we might be going beyond this week or this month or this year. And that is a strength sometimes because I don't get easily distracted by other potential things in the future, but it can be a challenge when I'm needing to provide a vision or work towards a vision. So knowing this, it means that I can align myself with people who are better at futuristic thinking, who can establish what that vision of the future is, and then I can work with my own strengths to work towards that. When we identify our least strengths, there's lots of things that we can do with them. We can try and get better at them. So we can try and get better at enjoying or participating well in competitive environments. I don't know that I necessarily want to be like that, though. It doesn't align with the way in which I like to work. More significantly, what I can use this information for is to recognize them as vulnerabilities, to recognize that these are areas that I'm not good at working in, and ways that I can use my other strengths to be able to offset that. I can also use this to some extent to work better with other people. There are people that I work with for whom, if I had to guess, I would think that competition would probably be one of their top 5 strengths. The way in which they always work and behave is always towards winning in any kind of competition or competitive environment. So they see the world as winners and not winners, as opposed to more collaborative and cooperative. And that can be a strength when competition is the environment in which you're working. So I can recognize that in others. If I'm leading people who are like that, I can think about ways to provide opportunities for them to build on that strength. Or if I'm needing to work with other people, to help with a particular problem, I can identify people who might bring strengths in that I don't particularly have. Does anybody have any questions about least strengths and the assessment work that we've talked about so far? So Part of the reason that we're doing this work to understand what our strengths are is so that we can cultivate and build on them, so that we can use them and improve them in ways that will allow us to be more effective and making a bigger contribution to our work. A lot of times people talk about strengths as if they are tools, things that we can go to and take out of a box and use to take action when we're solving a problem and building a relationship. For me, the difficulty in thinking about strengths specifically as tools is that, first of all, they very rarely work completely independently. And second of all, if we just think about them as tools, we may find ourselves using them in situations where it's not appropriate. If we think about the saying, to a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, that's what we're talking about when we think about strengths as being tools. We shouldn't be using strengths, or I shouldn't use my equalizer strength or my connector strength in situations where it's not appropriate. But if I keep going back to those strengths as if they're tools, I might be using them in ways that's not building on them and is not contributing to what it is that we're working towards. So I prefer to think about strengths as ingredients. And we need to understand what our strengths are, what all of the ingredients are for our recipe, and then we need to bring them together in combinations that make sense and get us to a successful completion of our work or the projects that we're working on. And we also need to remember that we can have too much of a good thing. We can use strengths in ways that are inappropriate, and if we use them over and over again in environments where they don't make contributions, we can actually start to undermine that strength in ourselves and use it in ways that's not actually going to be contributing to a successful resolution. So when I think about my own strength as being an equalizer, one of the characteristics of somebody who has equalizer as a strength role is that they are good at decision making. And I have had feedback that this is something that I'm good at. I'm good at assimilating information quickly to be able to make a decision, and also to be able to recognize when we don't have enough information, make a sound decision. So if we are going to proceed, that we have this vulnerability because we don't have all the information that we need. Now, all this is good, but if I use this decision-making approach, if I always step in, assimilate information, and make quick decisions, I can actually make it worse. And the strength becomes a hammer instead of a part of a recipe. If I'm always the one who's stepping in, assimilating information, making decisions, I'm taking opportunities away from others to learn to do that same thing, to demonstrate their own strengths and abilities in the work that we're doing. If I'm always the one who's saying, no, we don't have enough information for that, I could be seen as a roadblock because I'm always the one who's second guessing or undermining the decision that we're making. So I need to make sure that when I use this particular strength, I use it in environments and situations where it makes sense, where I'm actually enhancing and positively contributing to something rather than just using my strength over and over again in my work. Cultivating strengths means being aware of what your strengths are and using them appropriately and not overusing them. So not using them in situations where it doesn't make sense. That awareness of your strengths is important because it does allow you to consciously do that. And I can tell you that having that knowledge for myself about what my strengths are, I do consciously think about, would this be the right approach to take? Does this make sense in this particular environment? Is this the right role for me to be playing in this particular situation? I can also think about how some strengths are complementary. So being an equalizer is actually very complementary to being a connector because I'm looking to make those connections between people so they both have opportunities to be successful. So they have equal roles or equal opportunities to play. I can also think about my personal priorities. So when I do my goal setting every year, one of the goals that I have and the priorities that I set for myself and my work is that I want opportunities to contribute to the development of others. And using my equalizer strength, I can think about that in that context. And is this approach that I'm going to take going to align with that particular priority of contributing to the development of others? When we think about our least strengths, we might also think about these as blind spots or weaknesses that we might have. And our strengths themselves can have built-in blind spots or weaknesses associated with them. We can make the decision consciously or not to use a strength, and it cannot be appropriate. But there can also be vulnerabilities hidden within those strengths because there are our least strengths also in place. So as an equalizer, while I have the strengths of good decision making and being seen as resolving problems or conflicts between people, I have some vulnerabilities there. An equalizer works best with facts and wants to get all the information that they can get together in order to make a good decision. And that means that I don't like working in an environment where there's deception or dissembling going on. I don't handle untruths very well when I'm working with other people. And it also means that I'm not good at recognizing deception or untruth in the environment. If somebody is trying to deceive me, as an equalizer, I'm expecting everybody to be working fairly, and so I might not see that. It means that I'm vulnerable in political engagements, and I definitely am not a good card player because I can't hide what it is that my strength is when I'm in a good situation. That also relates to I'm not good at competition. When I think about being a connector, one of the strengths and features of being a connector is that I enjoy linking people together. So not only am I good at recognizing when two people might be able to work well together, I also enjoy doing that and seeing people being successful with that new connection or relationship. But it can also mean, this is the blind spot of this particular strength, that it means if I'm not included in connections between people, I can feel like I'm being left out. And that can lead to dissatisfaction with a particular relationship or environment. And sometimes when you're using your connector strength, and if you're using it too much, it can be seen that you're passing off work to other people. So you don't want to work with somebody, you just want them to go and work with somebody else. So I have to use these skills and strengths appropriately, and I have to recognize where they might not be suitable and where I might have some vulnerability associated with them as well. So overall, a recipe for cultivating strengths, for bringing all of our strong points and ways in which we like to work and can contribute best, bringing all of those together in a recipe for success looks something like this. And this is the name approach: name, aim, and claim. Name, we need to identify what those strengths are. We need to be able to describe it and call it what it is and understand how well we can use it and where there might be some blind spots associated with it. We need to own these things. We need to recognize that these strengths are ours. Other strengths that we might aspire to may not be things that are suitable for the way in which we like to work and behave. So that all of the strengths are positive. The ones that are determined for us as being a part of the way in which we work, we need to claim those and own them and then build on them. And that's the aim part of it. So once we understand what our individual strengths are, we can make conscious efforts to focus on, build them, and use them. And just like muscles that we want to be building up and maintaining, the strengths that we have, the more we use them, the more they're going to be sustained and there for us when we need to be using them in the future. So some other things to think about when it comes to cultivating and building on our strength. It does take some personal commitment. You do have to spend the time assessing yourself, doing the reading and the work around it, and then also spending the time to be mindful and aware of the way in which you're working with other people, to recognize when you are using your strengths, when it's appropriate to use them, and where there might be some vulnerability. So in addition to the personal commitment, it takes some work and some ongoing work. Doing the assessment, reading the book, and then forgetting about it isn't going to allow you to cultivate the strength. We need to know what they are, we need to build on them, and we need to own them. Being aware of the way in which we interact with other people can allow us, again, to recognize our strengths and the way in which we're using them. And it also allows us to think about the others that we're working with. Knowing how to assess strengths and the approach that's taken for us can allow us to maybe infer what somebody else's strengths are and how we can work with them and around that. So it requires self-awareness and self-reflection. You have to take the time to be able to investigate for yourself and be aware of and pay attention to the way in which you're behaving and thinking about it afterwards. How could you have done something better? How could your strengths have been added to that situation? Or how can your strengths add to a situation that's currently going on? And we need to be kind with ourselves when we're doing this. There are going to be things that we think we're good at that we're actually not. We need to recognize that that's okay. We can't possibly be good at all things. We can be good at a lot of things, and we need to use those to our best advantage. And when we find ways to apply things consciously and specifically and successfully, we need to celebrate those things and recognize them. As I mentioned before, I did a lot of this work. I did the work itself, but I worked with a coach through a lot of the strength assessments that I've done and the work that I've done to be aware of how to use and apply those in the environment. I'm a big advocate of working with a coach on things like this. It's very helpful to have that independent outside voice to help you assess what it is that you're doing and allow you to learn from your experiences and your behaviors in ways that you can be more effective and successful. So just to close off, they often say you don't know your own strength, and I think that that's often very true for a lot of us. We don't know what our strengths are, but perhaps another way to think about it is we don't know how to describe them, and we don't know how to name, claim, and aim them. And that's what doing an assessment does. It allows us to understand what our strengths are and build on them all together for that recipe for being successful. So to close off, to cultivate our strengths, we need to know what they are. We need to do that work to name them before we can start claiming them and working on them. And we do need to also think about our least strengths. You can refer to them as weaknesses if you like, but I prefer the least strength language because it allows us to recognize them as vulnerabilities rather than just things that we're not good at, and allows us to use that information to cultivate our strengths and look for opportunities to apply them. Our strengths need to be sustained through ongoing use. And so looking for opportunities to use them in a positive, effective way is the best way to keep building and cultivating them for yourself. And with that, we come to the end. So I'll see if anybody has any questions.
Thanks so much, Robyn. That was very interesting. I actually had a question. If people right now perhaps don't want to spend the money on an assessment, do you think it would be helpful for them to maybe speak with friends or family and kind of get some suggestions on what their strengths might be? I don't know if maybe there's any kind of free materials that they could use as a guide for generating ideas about strengths, but I just thought that that might be something, as a starting point. What do you think about that?
I think that's a great idea. Being able to talk to people that you are close to, who are able to be honest with you about your performance and your behavior in a positive way, and in a way that's going to allow you to then describe what those strengths are and be able to build on them. And I think that's a great approach. Another approach that you can take that doesn't involve money, but it does involve some time commitment, is to do some searching online, finding articles of interest that are about strengths, that are about building on particular things that you're good at. There's lots of literature out there about this that's readily accessible. But also taking the individual time to do that self-assessment and that self-reflection, and take the time within your work environment to consciously recognize when you have a strength and you're going to be applying it, when you have areas where you have a weakness or a vulnerability, and how can you change that a little bit to make sure that you're able to be effective in those kinds of situations. So that self-awareness and reflection is essential in any assessment like this, and doesn't require a coach or a book or anything like that.
Yeah, thanks. And if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box. We'll leave a few minutes for questions now. I did think it was really interesting, Robyn, how you were saying that there's sort of the blind spot. So even a strength can sometimes, have sort of that other side where it could be a blind, result in a blind spot. It reminded me a bit of a book called Quiet, which is, if there are any other introverts tuning in, because I know there might be a few of us. It was a good book, a really good book to read. But I know initially when I was reading it, it took me a while to sort of come to terms with I am an introvert. It's okay to be an introvert. That's a good thing. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I don't know if anyone else has experienced what Robyn described, that maybe you have a strength that is really helpful in a lot of environments or a lot of situations, but then maybe there's times where it could be a least strength or a blind spot. Um, but like I said, if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat box. And we'll just give a minute. I do want to thank everyone for joining us, and thank you, Robyn, for the great presentation. We really appreciate it. We do hope you enjoyed today's webinar, and I'll just give a little information on our next webinar. It's on June 10th, and it's part 2 in a web series on mental health and wellness for graduate students. The title is Breaking the Silence, a candid discussion on mental health and work-life balance in grad school and beyond. And I see Eva says, thank you, Robyn. Thanks, Eva. Robyn will also be joining us later this month for a project management Q&A. So this will be more of a video conference style. We'll have some information to send out ahead of time, and everyone is welcome to join us if you have any research project management questions. And I see a question from Jonathan has come in. Jonathan says, do you think there's a connection between personal strengths and personal values?
That's a really good question, Jonathan. There probably is, in the sense that being aware of what your strengths and your values are then allows you to choose environments that you're going to work and participate in to be able to use them. I do think that the connection is a one that individuals would have to make. I don't think that there would necessarily be strengths that then make you a better or worse person, or align with specific values. I don't think that a connector is associated with any specific types of values, but I think people can make those connections in ways that then allow them to contribute to things that are valuable to them in a way that is most powerful and effective.
Yeah, thanks, Robyn. And it seems like finding that alignment can be helpful too. Oh, there's a
Yep.
question about how to register for the session on June 10th. So I will send an email out to everyone with registration information. You can also find it on Meopar's website. And that's www.meopar.ca. And actually, I could also type it in the chat box in a moment. So thanks for that question, Francis. And thanks, Jonathan, as well. I'm sorry, Robyn, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add to the personal values question with the story for myself about the strengths envy and not liking the connector description. Part of the reason that I didn't like it was the vision that I got in my head of the I guess the kind of person who would have connector as a strength. And I just had this vision of a very aggressive salesperson, somebody who always wants to know who you know so that they can use that for themselves. That's kind of what I ended up in mind. And the value personal value I would associate that with would be someone who's quite avaricious, quite aggressive in the work that they do in ways that's not necessarily contributing to anyone's benefit other than their own. It did take me some doing to revisit the connector strength and see that there's a lot of different ways that can be applied, and the way in which you use it would then align with your individual values. So the way that I use it is in contributing to the work of others and to the benefit of the projects that I work on. So I guess that would be where the connection would be, is how you perceive it and how you choose to use it in your work or in your life, and you can align that with your own values and the way in which you want to be.
Yeah, thanks again, Robyn. That's, I think, a good point to wrap up on. So Again, thank you, everyone. Please follow us on Twitter and check out our events page. And as I said, we will be sending information on our upcoming sessions and the recording for this session. So everyone stay well and have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.